All right. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about social justice advocacy, specifically about what happens on an individual level and how we can move towards a collective and even towards liberation. So what I have up here is the cycle of liberation. And when we think about liberation, right, there's a lot of things, a lot of terms that come to our mind when we think about liberation. Liberation, very broadly, is critical transformation. So in the previous lecture, we talked about liberation politics. So if we put these words together, right, critical transformation of politics. With this particular model, what it does is describe the different patterns that occur commonly within each stage. And we're going to go through all of them. The first stage, waking up. So this is where it's a critical incident or a gradual process that elicits some disturbance. And when I mean disturbance, I'm talking about cognitive dissonance. If you have taken Psych 102, cognitive dissonance is this tension between your own recognitions of your actions and how they don't align with what you really believe in. So within cognitive dissonance, what people tend to do is change their beliefs, change their values to accommodate their behaviors. So within this particular stage, right, so a critical incident might be where a person who identifies as heterosexual, they might have a gay coworker. That coworker may be referred to as different. However, as they hang out with one another, they go to lunch, so forth and so on. That person with that privileged identity recognizes that, hey, they are a person. They're not as different as I thought. And this creates some kind of tension within that person, okay? So taken together, waking up is the first stage that we get to within the cycle of liberation. And it's important to note that some people move in and out of these different stages. This is the case. This is especially the case for waking up. A person can recognize that their actions and beliefs don't align, and they can move out. So getting ready. So this is a really weird state. This is where we have that information and we can't not know it. We can't unknow it. So this might be you going to a movie and you recognize the biases within this movie and you're like, dang it, I can't have fun anymore. Or this isn't as fun as it used to be. Mainly because you recognize that there's some bias there, some oppression stuff coming up. So within this particular stage, you see these different things happening, this empowerment of self. So this this occurs through the dismantling and building of aspects of who you are. So in the beginning of the stage, you might be challenging some of the values, some of the worldviews that you held before you got to know that information. And during this stage, you're going to see people building up different worldviews of themselves, not reviews of themselves, but aspects of themselves and even their worldview. And this might occur through a lot of times introspection, so looking inward, some education. So this might be learning about the history of a privileged or marginalized group. And it may also occur with consciousness raising. So taken together, when it comes to this particular stage, it's the stage where you're in this weird limbo. You can't unknow it, and you have a hard time doing your best to go back. Reaching out, this is where you're reaching out towards other folks. You're recognizing that there's injustices and you're naming them. So this might be that coworker, this might be that privileged coworker reaching out to their coworker and having dinner with their partner, okay? What tends to happen is there's the seeking of outside, of experiences that are outside of that person's reality. And this is where there's this opportunity for feedback. So getting the perspective of another human, particularly of a human who has a marginalized identity. There's also this possible pressure that a person may experience. This might typically occur by members of the marginalized and the privileged group. More oftentimes, it's from folks who are privileged. It's suggesting that you're changing the status quo, you're shaking it, right? So that's where that pressure typically comes from. We also see possible pressure from those of the marginalized group, suggesting that you're never going to change anything, as an example. So reaching out very broadly is a stage where you're seeking out exposure to outside realities other than your own. Now, as we're moving from reaching out to building community, where you're noticing an interpersonal change, so how you see other people. And this is really important in doing this with this particular stage, right? Changing the way in which we value other people and interact with them, right? That's really big if we're going to try to build that community, build a coalition. So not a couple, but last lecture, right, for social justice advocacy, we talked about the ways in which we're going to build a community. And one of the ways that we do that is by being authentic and going deep. This is really being authentic and going in depth with that person, especially a person who has a different identity than you, allows you to move past those differences and move towards a common goal. So this particular stages has 2 steps. The first one, dialoguing with people who are like us. So this is really in reference to people who share the same identities that we do. It might be privileged identities, and this is where you find that support, okay? Whereas dialoguing with people who are different, that is where you're still continuing on seeking out those experiences and that exposure. And there's this discussion of moving past these differences, not moving past them. There's this appreciation of the differences and the recognition of sameness, that we're working towards a common goal, and that can be to end oppression, to foster liberation. Coalescing is really the action stage, right? So this might include organizing, action planning, fundraising, lobbying. You might also see some educating as well, right? And really with this particular stage, this is where that person, as an individual, they assertively express themselves. You also see the changing of energy from anger and frustration to hope and shared power. So at the beginning of these stages, right, when you have the waking up process and getting ready, there's a lot of frustration, a lot of guilt, shame, disappointment. And with all of these emotions, these difficult emotions, they typically formed in as a result of not being able to, first off, pick what or be able to express who they are, right, from the outset, and that they've played into these roles that they've been socialized into. And we see these difficult emotions being transformed into something that is that allows people to move into action. Creating change. So this is where these critical transformations happen, right? So we have built this community and we foster a new culture that reflects that community. You might also see a greater amount of partnerships across these differences. And I do want to make note that critical transformation looks different in different places. So what does this mean? So when we talk about change, right, change doesn't come automatically. It takes time. With this particular stage, certain things are going to change compared to others. So there might be more change in assumptions and structures and definitions, but not a lot of change in policy, rules, risk, uh, as an example, okay? And this might be occurring in different institutions. Different changes may be occurring in different institutions compared to others. So it's really just important to recognize that change is going to look different in different places. Now, maintaining, right? This is one of the harder stages. So maintaining is basically where we're working together to make sure that the efforts that we've achieved are still in place. And this is really, to be very honest, it's really hard because people do tend to be a little bit more dissuaded when it comes to maintaining the changes that have occurred. So this might be fostering hope and inspiration across different groups. You may also see some acceptance of accountability, and that's really important, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but right now, I just want you to know that maintaining is basically where you're working together to make sure that the efforts that have been achieved are still maintained. Now, the core is really what it is, a set of qualities and aspects that can be very reflective of what liberation is. So let me balance all these out. So these are the, oops, sorry. So these are the different parts of the core of the cycle of liberation. So taken together, I'm not going to go into them I'm not going to go into too much detail. And I want y'all to recognize that each of these things are really important when it comes to liberation. Practice of love, that is like a hallmark. And it's not just love of others and love for others, it's also self-love. Because that's really where it starts. It starts within. And taken together, all of these are really important. I just want to emphasize to y'all, like, don't pick one over the others. Finding a balance is really, really, really important. So we talked about the cycle of liberation. Now let's talk about how we're going to move toward a whole new vision. So when we're trying to end oppressions, there are a lot of barriers. And one of these barriers, not one, but these barriers can be overcome through forming common coalitions, forming community that facilitates that social change. Now, there are different things that impact our ability to form relationships, okay? So the book talks about three main things: differences in power and privilege, coalitions around common causes, and building empathy. So when it comes to differences in power and privilege, right, it's really important that we recognize different experiences that each of us have. And with these experiences, they can create problems or barriers in forming an authentic relationship between each other. So what does that look like, right? Because we talked a little bit about it in the first part, where we know that oppression drives disconnection and fuels disconnection, and disconnection facilitates isolation. So the solution would be to connect. Now, here's where it gets a little hard. When it comes to privilege, privilege doesn't allow people to see how they benefit. So in extreme cases, in particular, members of privileged groups may raise the very presence of the less privileged. So that might look like people saying, oh, that's not a thing. We don't believe it. You know, we don't think police brutality is a thing. We don't believe that ableism is a real oppression, right? That's the power of the privilege. In some cases, you may also see these instances of voyeurism, a look at how the different operate. This might look like blatant cultural appropriation, where members of privileged group pick apart what experiences they want to see or they want to experience and say, this is what it's like for the person who is different to live. Okay, so it's this picking apart of a person's experiences. When it also comes with people with marginalized identities, there is this hesitancy to share perspective, mainly because when that perspective has been shared, it is manipulated and exploited. And in turn, that person is exploited. So in cases with people with privilege, there's this control of institutional and symbolic apparatuses of oppression, okay? Something that we have seen, right, in the coronavirus pandemic is the ways in which the differences in power and privilege operate. So uh, when we're looking at it, right, there are several weeks ago where you had a lot of members who presented as white and a little as black and as conservative, uh, doing protests for stay-at-home orders. And documenting or just saying that this is what oppression feels like, so forth and so on, right? That's an example of where privileged groups can erase the presence of the privileged, right? We also see differences in the ways in which the privileged have been treated within protests. We have seen protesters of color being arrested. There's heavier police force in the presence of protesters of color compared to protesters who are white. So the way in which this coronavirus pandemic has showed us, and also to document the health disparities in the deaths of members of communities of color dying from the coronavirus. Just to throw that out there, this pandemic has showed us the ways in which power and privilege operate in things that we would consider menial or trivial, right? So such as getting appropriate health care and receiving appropriate services, right? Something that we have seen within amongst members of color, people of color, especially Black folks, is that they report not so nice bedside manners. They also report negligence as well. So taken together, we do see that in cases with like hospital care, medical care, we see people getting different treatment based upon certain identities or are associated with certain identities. Coalitions around common causes. So it's really important to know about where, the reasons for forming this coalition. And one of the ways in which you can foster a coalition is by recognizing the common goal. Sharing a common cause helps people maintain relationship that transcends differences. Something that we've noticed in the literature, specifically within social psychology, is when people are working towards a common goal, they tend to work a lot better compared to when the goals are different. Another big one, building empathy. So it's really important to know the difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy allows you to go there with that person, whereas sympathy is just saying, I hear what you're saying, but keep it at a distance. It's more about tolerance and just hearing the person. Empathy is where you listen. And when it comes with privilege and individual accountability, this is where it gets really hard. What we tend to hear when it comes to accountability for oppressions, people say, that wasn't my fault. Don't blame me for the historical oppression, right? And yet there isn't the acknowledgement that that person benefits from that privilege. So taken together with individual accountability, when we take that into account and when we recognize it and we hold it, it allows us to move, it allows us to say, man, that's a lot. And thank you for, thank you for helping me move towards accountability. And I'm listening to what you're saying. So it allows you to go there with that person. So taken together, empathy is really important for individual accountability and even collective accountability. So if you don't know who this character is, this is Courage the Cowardly Dog. Courage the Cowardly Dog was a TV show that played on Cartoon Network. And in it, the plot was mainly around a dog named Courage who lived with people who were older adults. And Courage would save and protect them from the monsters, right? And Courage in every episode, while he was scared, while Courage was really scared, Courage demonstrated courage, right? So when we think about social justice advocacy, it can be very scary work, because that means you have to challenge your biases, your assumptions, the things that you've known for so long. And not only that, you have to, you're challenging members of your own group, right? So it's really, really, taken all together, scary, and it takes courage. And I want to acknowledge that if you've gone through this course up to this point, and really if you've entered into this course, that's courage. That's very courageous. So you're moving towards this liberation, right? And it's very brave of you to go through it. So now we're going to talk about doing the work. So what can we do on an individual level? So the very big thing is acknowledging that privilege and oppression exist, right? The acknowledgement of, oops, oh, hold on here. Something happened. Sorry about that, folks. So the acknowledgement that privilege exists is really important. The reason why it's important, because to be very honest, if you're doing the work and at the same time not taking that acknowledgement into account, then you're not really, it creates the question of where your concern is coming from. And paying attention is really important, because what we have seen is when we don't attend to certain things or certain behaviors, especially when they facilitate oppression, we're not able to address it in doing the work. And leading to the next point, learning how to listen. So within US America, and I think the culture, which is very individualistic, what we tend to see is people talk at each other instead of talking to each other. We tend to hear people hearing each other and not doing a lot of listening. So with this particular component, learning how to listen provides an opportunity to not only facilitate healing for members of the marginalized group and maybe even for the privileged group, it also allows you to form that relationship, form a empathic and authentic relationship with that person. So doing something. So this can range from a wide variety of things. Something that I want to emphasize is that doing something is not, is not just one thing. You can do protest. You can do the behavior. You can, if you want to protest, that's fine. That is not what all social justice looks like. Okay. It can be something that's very simple. And one thing I want folks to remember is remembering to start where people are at. Not everybody is ready to run the same race as you. And there are times when people, when you do your best to educate people, they're like, no, I don't think this is a thing, goodbye. And that's okay. And the reason why I say that's okay is because you provided that work, You provided that education. So whenever that person, hopefully gets to their own waking up stage, they can say, oh, this person brought me this information and this is what I did with it. So that's really important to note as well. Something as small as what you can, and that's an example of, social justice as well. Or just doing the work is providing people with education, okay? So taken together, doing something can be something as big as going out and protesting, writing out to your governors, to your mayors, to your elected folks, right? And something as small as sharing a piece of education on Facebook. Allyship. So really, this is a debated topic within social justice literature. And the reason why I say that is because there are some people who believe that allyship facilitates oppression within that marginalized space. A person is still benefiting from oppression within that space, and taking away the focus from the marginalized. Now, there are some people that suggest that having an ally can facilitate resistance against oppression. Now, it's more of a debate it's more of a debate, and I wish we could have had this in class, or a discussion about this in class. However, this is more so up to you. It's an interesting topic and something to talk about with maybe a member of a marginalized group that, where you want to resist that oppression. And to facilitate a little bit too, it's important to recognize your own stuff, and figuring out if what you're doing is really genuine concern, or you want the power, you want the recognition. So something that does tend to happen with folks who are allies is that there is this sense of clout, or this pursuit of clout. So what I'm saying is, a person might be saying, person who's focusing on clout or is making it about themselves, they're saying, oh, look at what I'm doing. This is awesome. This is the work that I love to do. And at the same time, I am doing this work. So notice that there's a lot more focus on the I instead of the we and the oppression. Whereas someone who is expressing genuine concern is saying, this is the work that needs to be done. This is the type of oppression it focuses on, it resists, okay? So it's focusing on the oppression, not on that person. So, let me go back. So taken together, these are some things that you can do in your own life that can facilitate resistance towards oppression and in doing the work. So this is the last lecture for today, for this course. I really do appreciate it. Please provide feedback where you can, where can this course improve, and so forth and so on. And that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.